Episode 13. Nyami Nyami and the Smoke That Roars. DeVette proposed that we go to Victoria Falls and whitewater raft down the mighty Zambezi River. He had a great friend, a fellow black belt and farmer in Zimbabwe named Martin, who lived en route about 5 hours away. Our karate had spread from South Africa into Botswana and Zimbabwe. DeVette had met Martin at a tournament. They had bonded in a very odd way. The speed and power of DeVette's roundhouse kick was well known. Before the tournament, the Zimbabwe fighters were warned of it. DeVette and Martin faced each other in the competition. DeVette said, "I hit him in the head with a roundhouse, and he just looked at me and smiled. I wasn't expecting that." Martin said, "He hit me in the head with a roundhouse, and I smiled because my sensei said he was really good, and he was right." That afternoon, we went to Martin's farm. He had named it the Compensation Farm. The house was a single-story cinder-block structure with a tin roof. The house was surrounded by a 10-foot-high chain-link fence with barbed wire on the top. On the outside of the fence, Martin had planted agave, the same plant tequila comes from. It had long, spiky leaves. The fence was primarily a defense against leopards, which were plentiful in the area. Nearby, there was an old outbuilding as well as a fair-sized barn for the horses. Martin had about 200 hectares, or about 4,000 acres of land that he ran cattle on. There'd been a drought for some years, and there was a lot of dead vegetation. Not much green grass anywhere. I met his mother, Gloria. Martin's father had died, but his mother still ran the farm. Their farms were in Metabili land. Many years before the famous Shaka Zulu defeated the British Army at Islandawana, one of his best generals was Msilakazi. There's a lot of stories about how he ran afoul of the Zulu king and had to flee with his army, his impis, north to the Transvaal. He conquered or absorbed the tribes that he found as he moved north. This was only 15 years before the Voortrekkers would leave Cape Town and come to this very place. When the trekkers eventually arrived, through war they displaced Msilakazi and his Metabili people. The Metabili continued their northward journey into what is now Zimbabwe. They encountered the Shona people, who they called the Dog people, and took over the northwest part of the country. And it's named, of all things, Metabili land. In 1889, Cecil Rhodes arrived into what is now Zimbabwe and negotiated with the then-king Lobengula for mineral rights. At the same time, he was given a mandate by the empire to create a British colony, and that's just what he did. Within 100 years, Rhodesia was one of the wealthiest countries in the world, certainly the wealthiest country in Africa. In 1973, it cost $1.73 U.S. to buy one Rhodesian dollar. The white Rhodesian farmers were the first in the world to be able to produce 2 tons of grain on 1 acre of land. The country was called the breadbasket of Africa. Unemployment ran about 4%, and the government provided free school and health care to all its citizens. The country was run by a white minority government. Approximately 300,000 whites were in Rhodesia, and they ruled over 11 million blacks. Compared to the rest of Africa, the indigenous population lacked for nothing except the vote. In 1964, with the start of the Rhodesian Bush War, one of the many conflicts that sprang up across the continent as native people rebelled against colonial rule. Like Vietnam, it was a Cold War proxy war. The combatants were the national government of Rhodesia, which fielded an army of about 10,000 soldiers. The ZANU-PF, led by Robert Mugabe, was made up of the Shona tribe. It was supported by the Russians and the North Koreans. They supplied them training and war material. There was also the ZAPU Party, which was led by Joshua Nkomo and was made up of the Metabili people. This faction was supported by the Chinese government. Interestingly enough, even a number of American Vietnam veterans and at least one French foreign legionnaire joined the Rhodesian Army. So did Martin. Martin joined the Gray Scouts, the last horse-mounted infantry unit in the world. Martin said one of their main jobs was patrolling the border for insurgents. In the evening, they would drag a harrow on the border road. That way, in the morning, they could tell if anyone had crossed from Zambia into Rhodesia. The scouts operated in 8-man teams, which they were called sticks, just like paratroopers. If they found tracks to cross the border, they would follow them, and on many occasions sort things out with a bloody result. Martin said that 120 insurgents against his 8 teammates was good kit, fair odds. He said some scientists had come up with a substance that they would drink that turned their skins dark, which helped to disguise who they were. Besides his farm, Martin also had a house about an hour away in the city of Bulawayo, where his wife and 2 children stayed during the week. We left the farm in the morning and continued on to Vic Falls. When the explorer Henry Morton Stanley came to Victoria Falls, he learned that the native people call it the smoke that roars. It's a fantastic waterfall. The mighty Zambezi River cascades over it, and there's a series of 22 Class 3 and 1 Class 4 rapids that it creates. People from all over the world come to run this river. It is considered the best whitewater rafting in the world. At least 1 person a year dies in the attempt. If you think the Colorado is a big deal, I urge you to YouTube Zambezi whitewater rafting. On the raft trip, you had 2 choices. You could ride as a passenger, as a guy paddle down the river with long sweeps, or you could paddle yourself with the other members of the raft. I went down the river 3 times, and each time I paddled. Most of the guides were from Botswana, although I did run into one who called himself Mad Dog from New Zealand. We wore life vests and helmets. We were told in the safety meeting that you always wanted to be a short swimmer. That meant if you fell out, you grabbed the safety line that went around the top of the raft. A long swimmer was a person that had no connection with the raft. Long swimmers were rescued by safety kayakers that escorted the rafts down the rapids. In the safety meeting, the guides told us that if we were to become a long swimmer, try to go down the river feet first, so you were more likely to bounce off the crocodiles. They also told us that if you get sucked under, keep your arms close to your body and cross your legs. That way you're less likely to catch a hand or a foot in a rock crevice and become trapped. They also told us that if you go under, keep everything tucked and count to 7. By the time you got to 7, you should be up. They said if you got to 60, then something was definitely wrong with your counting. We dropped in the river at the base of the falls, and off we went down the river, bracketed by 800-foot-high black basalt cliffs. The sound of the water was tremendous. Every rapid had its own name. The Wall, the Devil's Toilet Bowl, Boiling Pot, and Between Two Worlds were some of them. The power of the river is indescribable. At noon, we pulled out and had lunch. We finished our run about 2 in the afternoon and climbed out of the gorge. We were told, on average, it took about 45 minutes to get from our landing spot to the top. Once there, we would enjoy some very welcome cold beer before we went back to the base camp in Victoria Falls. The climb up was very steep, and there were primitive ladders made up of branches tied together that had been set against the wall to climb. I remember some wide-bodied Germans not be very pleased with that. It did take 45 minutes for us to make the ascent. The record was held by a Botswanan guide who made the climb in 12 minutes. In my travels in Africa, I spent the majority of my time in Zimbabwe. On the way from Martin's house to Victoria Falls, and particularly right around the falls, I was exposed to the local art. The Shona people are extraordinary stone sculptors who work in a soft stone called serpentine and a harder semi-precious stone called verdite. Near the falls, I found 2 tribes, the Botakas and the Sangas. These people work in wood, teak mostly. I was so fascinated with their work, I decided I would export it to the U.S. Consequently, I traveled all over Zimbabwe hunting for this beautiful art. When I first got into the Zambezi River Valley with Devet, he told me about the river god Nyami, perhaps the most important spirit of the Sangas. He holds sway over what goes on in and around the river, and he takes care of his people in times of need. He is depicted as a serpent with the head of a fish. Sometimes he's called the dragon. Before we went down his river, Devet purchased 2 small amulets, necklaces, which portrayed the river god. They were like a St. Christopher medal to ensure the safety of travelers. I was assured that they were essential for our survival if we were to fall into the river. I told you the people are very spiritual, and to them, Nyami is as real as paying taxes. In the 1940s, it was decided to dam up the Zambezi and create a hydroelectric power station. The valley would be dammed up and create Lake Kariba, which means trap. The Sangha people were relocated out of the valley and moved to higher ground. They were not pleased and were sure that Nyami would protest as well. In 1957, as the dam reached completion, the worst flood in Zambezi history occurred and washed away much of the dam, heavy equipment, and killed many workers. The next year, it happened again. Many bizarre and seemingly magical events occurred to stop the dam's completion. At the end, the dam was completed with one major problem. The dam separated Nyami from his wife, who'd been upstream fishing. The Sangha believe that it's only a matter of time before Nyami breaks the dam to reunite with his wife. Personally, I wouldn't bet against it. Another example of their belief in supernatural powers occurred on Martin's farm. I was sitting outside at a table playing solitaire when some of his helpers came over to watch. They seemed amazed at the way I shuffled the cards. I'd always been a fan of card tricks, and I started to show them a few. The usual, pick a card, any card, simple tricks. They just started to freak out. Martin came out of the house because he heard the commotion. He had a conversation with them in Metabili. He told me I was scaring them, and they thought I was a wizard. Apparently, my juju increased dramatically that day. After our raft trip, DeVette left me at Martin's farm. He was a great guy, very funny, very direct. We had both been soldiers, but the only similarity was that we had both been in war zones. Martin was a real soldier. Compared to him, I was a total poser. At the farm, Martin had a 9mm semi-automatic pistol, a .357 Magnum revolver, a 12-gauge shotgun from the war, and a scoped .30 caliber hunting rifle. When Martin left the farmhouse, he was always armed, and for good reason. He was a white farmer and an ex-Gray Scout. His life was always in peril. The Bush War had ended in 1978, and Robert Mugabe took power in 1980. My first visit was in 1998, 18 years later. The white population had gone from 300,000 to 50,000. The new Constitution had sanctions and restrictions on what was called the previously privileged people, the whites. The new Constitution was a framework for legal discrimination. The shoe was definitely on the other foot. I asked Martin why didn't he leave too. His answer was simple. He said, "This is my home." Since Mugabe had taken power, Martin summed it up as the typical African dictator scenario. The bloodshed hadn't stopped at the end of the Bush War. It had just begun. Remember I told you that the ZANU-PF, Robert Mugabe's party, was made up of the Shona people, the primary population of Zimbabwe. I told you that their rival fraction, the Zapu, consisted of the Metabili. Musilakazi had ridden roughshod over the Shona people when he arrived in their country 140 years ago. He basically took a third of the country. The Shona hadn't forgotten. After the white government was disposed of, the Zapu represented Mugabe's primary political rivals. The distrust that existed between the two groups made it impossible for the Zapu to be incorporated into the new national army. In typical African dictator style, Robert Mugabe simply murdered them and anyone else he deemed a dissident. His game plan was to have one-party rule within 5 years, which he accomplished. In other words, he would be the president for life, which in fact he was. He initiated the Gukurahondo, a genocide. It was carried out by the 5th Brigade, a unit that had been trained for 2 years in North Korea. If you were of the Metabili tribe and of military age, you were summarily executed or tortured, then killed, or beaten with sticks in the middle of your village and then killed. The very lucky were sent to the re-education camps. I believe you already know something about brainwashing. Re-education camps are where you go to get your mind right. They are present in every totalitarian regime. The Gukurahondo went on from 1982 until 1987. Over 20,000 Metabili were slaughtered, and the Mugabe government called it the dissident period. During this time, there were 2 assassination attempts on Martin. On the way to his farm, there was a 1-lane bridge. As Martin started to cross it, he noticed that behind him, a car came out of the bush and started to follow. At the same time, another car appeared on the other end of the bridge in front of him and blocked the road. Martin was trapped in the middle of the bridge. 5 armed men came out of one vehicle and 4 out of the other. In the ensuing gunfight, Martin killed them all. Another time, 6 men ambushed Martin on the road with similar outcome. Martin 6, insurgents 0. Martin was unusual in that he didn't flee the country like so many of his countrymen. Farmers had been killed or their land had been taken over by what Mugabe called war veterans. This was his idea of land reform. He gave highly productive, well-run farms to people that had no idea how to grow anything. It was just payoff to stay in power. Before the land reform, the labor force on the white farms had been close to 3 million people. After, only 100,000 made their living on the farms. Millions of Zimbabweans fled to South Africa. Martin told me a story that had occurred shortly before my second visit. He was on his way home from the hospital where he had a vasectomy. He was sore and swollen, and he was planning on healing at home for a day or 2. En route, he went by one of his neighbor's farms. He looked up the driveway at the farmhouse and just felt that something was wrong. He drove up to the house to investigate. Within, he found the husband murdered and the wife near death from being gang raped and beaten. Martin contacted the authorities and a comrade from the war, Booty York. I met Booty. He was a cinder block of a man, and he gave me some great advice. He said, "Jesse, if you ever find yourself in a Zimbabwe jail, there might be 30 people in a cell, but only 1 blanket. Find the guy with the blanket. Beat him up and take the blanket, and you'll be fine, because he was the baddest guy in the cell. And if you got the blanket, now you are." He told me as though he spoke from experience, and I believe he did. Booty shows up before the police do. Of course, they're both armed, and they want to get on the trail before it gets cold. They start to track the murderers on foot through the dense forest with a temperature over 100 degrees. Kilometer after kilometer, Booty and Martin tracked the killers through the bush. They were in contact with the police through a radio Martin carried. He arranged to meet them on a particular road that they were about to cross. They met up with 6 cops and continued. Within a few kilometers, all the cops had fallen back. They just couldn't keep up. Martin informed the authorities, and they arranged to meet on the next road. And once again, 6 officers met them, and they followed Booty and Martin a bit, and they disappeared in the rear. Martin said that after pushing for about 16 miles through the forest, they came to what he described as a bush bar. The men he'd been after were inside. Fearing they would escape, Martin knew he didn't have any time to wait for the cops. Martin made a simple plan. He would go in the front, and Booty would go in the back. The 7 men inside had no intention of being arrested. They'd already killed 1 person today, so why not 2 more? The wife also died a few days later. Martin and Booty lived. The other 7 men died. Martin said for some reason the vasectomy failed. There was only 1 state-run TV in the country on which President Mugabe appeared quite often. I listened to him continually rail against the West, particularly England and America, blaming them for all the troubles of his country. It was the outsiders, which was a euphemism for whites, that were the root of the problem for the country. Mugabe beat this particular drum constantly. The message was to get rid of the outsiders. Martin had 16 men working for him, and one morning he called them all to his lawn. He had them all line up on one side. He said, "If you weren't born in Zimbabwe, move over to the other side of the lawn." A couple men did. He said, "If your father wasn't born here, move to the other side of the lawn." By the time Martin got to your great-great-grandfather, only he and a guy named Spike who were left. Everyone else had shifted to the other side of the lawn. He said, "Spike and I have been here since our great-grandfathers. Are you the outsiders the president is talking about?" Martin's greatest sorrow was the condition of his country. 20 years ago, the Rhodesian dollar was valued at almost double the U.S. dollar. Now 10 greenbacks would buy you a $100 Zimbabwe bill. A Castle beer was 30 American cents. The first time I went to Zimbabwe, I changed money in South Africa. I had Zimbabwe currency left when I got back to South Africa, and they refused to take it back because it had no value. From then on, in Zimbabwe, I dealt in greenbacks to much greater effect. Martin's karate teacher, who was the chief instructor in Zimbabwe, had a school in Bulawayo, and he asked me to teach. For the next 4 years when I went to Zimbabwe, I would usually teach the weekly classes. Because I was a direct student of Sensei S, as well as being a student of the famous Sensei T, I was treated very well by the students and their families. At the end of training, the class would inevitably go to someone's house for a meal, which would turn into a party. I met some really great people there and shared some wonderful evenings with them. To a person, all the whites wanted to get out of Zimbabwe. There was really nothing left for them. Their money had no value. Unemployment was at 80%. The country was riddled with AIDS, but there was no free health care system like there had been before independence. Neither was there free education. People didn't go to school because they simply couldn't afford the school fees. Martin paid for the education of many of his workers' children. It had been the breadbasket of Africa. Rhodesia made a tremendous amount of money off the export of its agricultural products. Now, under Mugabe's land reform policies, people were starving. The white farmers' land had been seized and taken over by people that didn't know how to farm. A political reform was unlikely to happen. Mugabe's political opponents were either jailed or killed in vicious puma attacks. Of course, there's no pumas in Africa. What that refers to is that's the name of what the equivalent of our Humvee is in Zimbabwe. In the Zimbabwe army, it's called the puma. As far as I remember, at least 3 of his opponents were tragically involved in accidents with pumas. It was coincidental and surprising. The president was so sympathetic with the dead politician's family. When I started obtaining Zimbabwe art, I used Zimbabwe dollars and clothing in trade. I got these dollars from the families of the karate students. They were desperate for a currency that had a value. Whatever they would offer, I would take, because the rate of exchange they offered was ridiculous. The mother of one student, who was in the diamond business, gave me 100 to 1. She gave me 10,000 Zim for a $100 bill. I had a duffel bag of bills. As time went on, Mugabe continued to wreck the country's economy, at the same time becoming the 8th richest man in the world. By 2008, to buy $1, you would need 2,621,984,228 Zimbabwe dollars. And it would take you over 4 billion Zimbabwe dollars to buy that Castle beer. Only government creates inflation because only government can print money. Every new dollar that enters the economy dilutes the buying power of all the other dollars, so it takes more and more dollars to buy goods. Martin took me fishing on Lake Kariba, the largest man-made lake in the world. The lake creates a border between Zambia and Zimbabwe. It also has the most crocodiles per square meter than any other place on the planet. Crocodile hunting had been prohibited for some time, and they were everywhere. They looked like huge floating logs. There were crocs that are 30 feet long, real monsters that averaged 100 pounds per foot of length. Martin fished the lake for many years and told me that on the Zambia side, he'd seen a cow come down to drink, and a huge croc snatched it and it disappeared like magic. An 1,800-pound cow, just gone. Now you see it, now you don't. There were tigerfish in the lake that purportedly hit a lure at 40 miles an hour. On another trip, I fished for them with Devet. He caught a nice 20-pounder using a fly line, which was unheard of. Ask anybody. On this trip, we were fishing for bream. We call it tilapia. There's a lot of floating vegetation on Lake Kariba, but the hippos make channels that the boat can pass through. The wildlife in South Africa, and especially Zimbabwe, was just breathtaking and disconcerting. I remember a training session with Sensei Leo. It involved his many schools, and the vet was there too. He rented a hall somewhere, and as we're training, I looked out the window, and there's giraffes and wildebeests and zebras going by. Where I come from, you don't have to stop your car because there's an elephant blocking the road, and you never see a Cape hunting dog crossing sign. On this fishing trip with Martin, I baited my hook with a worm and reached over the gunnel to wash my hands. Martin advised me not to do that. Of course, I asked why. He said that the crocs will pick up the disturbance and just wait for it to happen again. And when it does, they'll come and snatch you. I would come to find out that Martin had a unique experience with crocodiles. On another fishing trip on Lake Kariba, he and a friend had been fishing when a storm came up. They got the boat to shore, and Martin was securing it on the shore side, and his friend had gotten out of the boat in knee-high water on the offshore side. As he walked to the stern to go to the beach, a croc grabbed him by the calf. There was a drop-off a few feet away. The croc was dragging Martin's friend to it. Martin raced to his friend and grabbed him underneath his armpits and fought with the croc for its prey. Martin slipped and he went down, lost his grip on his companion. The croc reached the drop-off, and it and Martin's friend disappeared into the lake. Without hesitating, Martin raced to the edge and jumped in. Lake Kariba is an artificial lake, and there are still a lot of old trees that are left under the water. Martin found his friend, grabbed him, and was able to brace his foot on the branch of one of these submerged trees. They wrestled for a moment, but when the croc tried to get a better grip on his prey, Martin was able to pull his friend away from the beast. Martin got his friend to the surface and back to the shallows. When the croc first hit Martin's friend, he screamed. People on the beach heard this and came to see what the commotion was. When Martin was dragging his friend back to the beach, the croc followed. But the people that had been alarmed, they'd come to the beach, picked up stones and sticks, and threw them at the croc and drove it away. 3 things occurred because of this event. Martin received the gold medal for bravery. The president himself, Robert Mugabe, put the highest civilian award around Martin's neck. Secondly, you don't mess with a croc. You don't snatch its prey out of its jaws. And if you do and survive, you must have very, very powerful magic. This feat elevated Martin's status tremendously with his Shona and Metabili neighbors. The third thing that relates to this story, I will tell you later. I can't stress how important and real juju is to the people that live there. The Zimbabwe government had made it almost impossible for a white person to fire a black worker. To alleviate this problem, if Martin wanted to get rid of a hand, he simply put a small juju bag made up of some hair, some bone, a collection of other natural items on the front seat of his pickup truck. At some point in the day, he would ask the worker to perform some task using the truck. Inevitably, the worker would go to the truck, get in, see the bag, and then just walk off the property, never to be seen again. Don't forget, voodoo was born in Africa. These people didn't have TVs, radios, computers. Some had a flip phone, but very few even had an electric light. In most of the villages I traded in, they'd never seen a plastic Bic lighter before. Besides the impact of magic on their lives, it seems that they perceive time differently. For example, Devet uses 3 types of food depending on the growth stage of the chickens. He called the youngest birds starters. His foreman, or boss boy, was called Jonas. He'd been there for many years. I was with him on the farm one morning when he asked Jonas, "Do we have enough starter food for the day?" Jonas said, "Yes, we have plenty." 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he went to Devet and told him, "Oh, we're out of starter food." Devet said, "Jonas, this morning you said we had enough." Jonas replied, "Oh, yes, boss, this morning we did have enough." I asked Devet about it, and he said, "It's always like this. It's always been like this." One of his helpers' cars broke down. It had been running rough and belching smoke for a week. Devet asked him why he hadn't fixed it. The worker responded, "Why fix it? It was running yesterday." They had difficulty looking into the near future and predicting what might occur. They just couldn't plan ahead. Maybe that's what Devet's chicken customer meant when he said, "We can only think for one day, and the white man can think for 3. There's a cultural evolution theory that may come into play. There have been very few great empires in the tropics. The vast majority of them have occurred in temperate climates. Genghis Khan, the Mongol Emperor, Rome, the Incas, Aztecs, Egypt, Persia were all in temperate zones. The theory postulates that an organism only evolves if it's stressed. In the tropics, food is always available because there's a continuous growing season. In the tropic, life's abound. Game is plentiful, and the climate is such that you only need a simple roof on your dwelling. In a temperate climate, you need to develop a lot of skills to survive. First, you have to have some idea of astronomy so you know when to plant your crops. Then you need to harvest your crops and be able to preserve them as well as meat in some way. You need to fashion clothing by learning to tan skins or spinning and weaving some kind of fiber. You need to make tools to help build a dwelling that will keep you alive in the winter. The engineering of the Egyptians and Romans took advanced mathematics and building techniques that we cannot duplicate today. Necessity, indeed, is the mother of invention, and the harsher the climate, the more necessities you're going to need to invent. Now, let me be clear. I'm making no judgment about the African people I met or tropical cultures in general. Just making an observation. I call myself an American nomad, but I'm just a wannabe compared to the Quiva people of the Amazon rainforest. I have shifted my camp 73 times. If I was born a Quiva, that number would be 26,645 to date. From my perspective, these guys have it made. If a definition of affluence is how much of your day is used to secure your daily needs, then they are a very affluent people. They move camp every day, and on the way to the next camp, the men use their bows and arrows and blowguns to bring down game. The women collect roots and berries and other edibles. By midday, they arrive at their new campsite with food, throw up the simplest shelter, and spend the rest of the day making love to their wives and playing with their kids. They carry everything they own in the world. So could I until I was the age of 32, and I was very pleased about that fact. I wasn't burdened with the responsibility of safeguarding and maintaining possessions. Well, ranchers started encroaching into the Quiva's territory. The Quiva were exposed to metal knives, pots, pans, and mirrors. They left their idyllic life of leisure and started working 12 hours a day for very low pay to obtain trinkets. They became slaves to obtain possessions that in the past they'd never needed. There are a number of tribes that live in this manner. In Africa, the Kalahari Desert Bushmen, and in the Congo, the Pygmies are nomadic forest dwellers. The Australian Aboriginals certainly live a similar lifestyle. My point is the cultures are neither good nor bad, they're only different. I'm just glad that I've had a chance to experience and learn from so many of them. The next year, the World Championship was being held in Pretoria, South Africa. A number of my students from my dojo qualified for the team by winning the nationals, but the cost and logistics of the venture were just too much for the families. I remember seeing the South Africans in Switzerland. It was one of the first events that they entered after apartheid. They showed up in red sweatsuits. The top was a hoodie. On the back of the hoodie, it said South Africa. On the front over the chest, it said Black Cat Peanut Butter. And down the legs of the sweatpants, it said Black Cat Peanut Butter. The South Africans were able to get some support for their team from their countrymen. Target wasn't cutting the U.S. team any checks. Consequently, only 3 students of mine were able to make the trip. My daughter, who won a bronze in the last World Championships, a 16-year-old boy and his parents. The boy won a silver and a gold at that same event, and my son. The age limit for the World Champs was 12. My boy had gotten old enough to compete. It was like he was finally tall enough to ride the roller coaster. By the time he reached 12, he'd already been training 8 years. He started when he was 4. It wasn't my idea, but he saw that his sister and I were always going to class. He begged me to go. I finally relented and brought him to class. I figured it would be a one-time deal, but he was unbelievable. I had only one other student, another little guy who, like my boy, had an uncanny ability to concentrate and self-correct. The kid was a prodigy. In the Northeast, he'd never been beaten. He had started competing at 5, and by the time he was 12, he had shelves full of trophies and more medals than he could carry. Because of the proximity in this tournament, we had full teams from Botswana and Zimbabwe. In the past, it had been just too expensive for these teams to go to Europe or Japan. The tournament was a great time, in part because all my students medaled. After the tournament, my children and I headed for Devet's. There his wife taught them to eat ice cream for breakfast. We went to Kruger National Park. We were awed by a vast number of animals of all descriptions. After Kruger, we headed to Zimbabwe to see Martin and his family. Martin had a boy and a girl. Their ages matched my kids. My son was 12 years old at the same time as his boy, but the difference in the level of maturity was astounding. That comes from living in a place where death is literally around every bend in the trail. One morning on the farm, the kids and I saddled up some horses and went for a ride. My boy let his horse gallop ahead. Martin's son asked me to tell my boy to keep his horse at a walk. I asked him if he was afraid my boy might fall off. He said, "You never know, and there's only 2 ambulances in the country, and President Mugabe has them both." He told me that when he was 10, he and his father were working with the cattle. His dad got kicked by a cow. He suffered a broken arm and some broken ribs. His dad couldn't drive, so he loaded him into the truck and drove 32 kilometers to an aid station. Basically, if you get in trouble in African bush, you're pretty much on your own, so it's best to be as careful as possible. Sage advice from a 12-year-old that's been growing up in Africa. A couple of nights later, the girls decided that they would camp out in a tent on the lawn. Martin's perimeter fence had one tree growing along it that had a branch that overhung the fence. The girls pitched their tent beneath it to take advantage of the shade. Later that night, the girls said goodnight and went to sleep in the tent. At some point, Martin's daughter woke mine with her fingers to her lips. Shh! They heard the low, rumbling growl of a leopard that was known to the family emanating from the tree above them. Martin's daughter directed mine to the rear of the tent. She moved a cooler they had brought to the front of the tent. She grabbed her pistol and lay down on her back with her feet braced against the cooler. Her gun was loaded with birdshot, but she hoped the cooler would slow the animal down long enough to get a couple of rounds off in its face. They waited in the dark, hoping they wouldn't have a midnight visitor. After hearing nothing for half an hour, they peeped out and saw no sign of the cat. Like I said, growing up in Africa is a little different than Cleveland. My children and I had a wonderful time at Martin's farm. He was a great man with a great family. The boys would get in the Land Cruiser and go hunting for guinea fowl. The girls would ride horseback in the bush. One night, the girls were introduced to marula, which is a drink made from the marula tree. It's reminiscent of Irish cream. We spent a delightful night in a great society listening to Creedence Clearwater Revival. The next year, I went in October a little earlier than usual. In previous trips, I had gone to Africa once the quarry had closed, and that was usually in November or December. The last time Devet and I had run the river, we were told that the best water was in October. Devet and his wife had a thoroughbred horse. His wife rode it in endurance competitions. She was a nice bay mare. Western saddles are a rarity in South Africa, but Devet had purchased one. It was brand new. He'd never used it before. He tells me he's going to give me the first ride on it. He saddles up the mare, and we go to the paddock. The paddock consists of posts about 10 feet apart with a rail on top. It's about 4 feet high. I mount the horse, put her into a trot, and start circling the paddock. The saddle starts to slip. Devet hadn't tightened the girth enough. Centrifugal force is drawing me to the outside. Whoa isn't working. I have a death grip on the reins with my left hand and a handful of mane in my right. All this is happening very quickly. The pressure of the reins on the horse's neck was driving him closer and closer into the rail. By this time, my head was just below the paddock rail. I knew I had to time my release so I didn't hit my head on one of the posts. I let go and hit a post mid-thigh. I thought for sure my leg was broken. At the same time, I managed to crack a couple ribs. I walked it off, rubbed some dirt on it, and Devet apologized profusely. I would use this assassination attempt to my advantage often on this trip. We went to Vic Falls, and the wave train was huge. When you go down the river, you want to stay on top of it. If you fall off, you can wind up against the wall. Not good. Our guide was someone that we knew from our last trip. He was a Botswanan named John the Baptist. He instructed us, the 6 members of the crew, in basic paddling techniques. We put in, at the bottom of the falls, in the last still water we'd see for some time. We practiced getting short swimmers back into the boat. You'd grab their life vest on each shoulder, dunk them under the water, and use the buoyancy of the life vest to help you bring them up and over the side of the raft. We also had safety kayakers that escorted us down the river. Their job was to retrieve long swimmers. These guys were absolutely out of their minds. That's all I can say about that. Off we go. John the Baptist is steering while we paddle. The water is boiling and roaring. In the first 5 rapids, we only have a couple of short swimmers that we quickly get back into the raft. On the next rapid, it all goes horribly wrong. The boat goes airborne and flips over. Everyone's dumped in the river. The boat lands upside down right in front of me. I make a grab at the safety line and get it. Then the river jerks it out of my hand. It was on the side with my bad ribs. I was thinking about how badly that hurt when I got sucked under. It was like being in a 100-decibel washing machine. I tucked up and counted to 7. Then I counted to 7 again. Then I counted to 7 again. This went on for some time. It was like being in the foam of the ocean. There was so much air in the water, my life jacket just couldn't bring me to the surface. I didn't really expect to die that day, especially by drowning, but I guess we never expect to die on a particular day. I had pretty much given myself up for dead when I popped to the surface. Happy day. I located the raft and got some idea how long I'd been underwater. Long enough for John the Baptist to swim to the raft, climb on top of it, turn it over, get in, and by the time I surfaced, he was helping his third person into the raft. I guess more than a 60 count. A safety kayak spotted me and paddled over. I hung on to the bow of the kayak as he paddled me over the raft. I was hurt, but I made it out. We climbed out of the gorge and went back to Martin's. My leg had a spectacular bruise from hitting the post. It was an intriguing shade of purple on my left side, from just above the knee to my lower back, and on both inside and outside of my leg. I was a little gimpy and my ribs hurt, but my students I'd been training for a number of years were anxious to see me. They had become quite proficient in the techniques that I had shown them, which was gratifying, because the only way to achieve that is by practice. I was glad to see that they valued them enough to do so. I went back home and started working in the quarry in spring. Dear listener, if you have enjoyed this episode, please share it. A 5-star review on Spotify or wherever you listen would be greatly appreciated. You can follow me and my Mastiff, Drax the Destroyer, on the It's in the Blood Facebook page. Or you can send me an email at jesse.it'sintheblood@gmail.com. Thank you so much for your support.